comes to us from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. Blessed be the reading of his word, and bless his holy Sabbath.
Well, good morning and happy Sabbath. Today I want to talk about how Jesus kept the Sabbath. And I know when we bring up that subject, our minds often go straight to the New Testament, to the gospel account. And the gospel stories are filled with the examples of how Jesus kept the Sabbath. But I want to start with the creation account. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the last day of creation was a Sabbath. And it was the first Sabbath for Adam and Eve. And the second reason is that's our first example in the Bible of how Jesus kept the Sabbath. So I want to begin with Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. All right? How did Jesus keep the Sabbath? Well, who did Jesus spend the seventh day of creation with? He spent it with Adam and Eve, didn't he? And by creation, Adam and Eve were his children. But also, Jesus cleared his schedule. Jesus made a day where he had nothing else on the schedule and he could spend his time with his children. One of my earliest memories from childhood was when I was 1 year old through 5 years old. My father was in medical school. And medical school is nonstop studying and nonstop classes. And all my memories of my early childhood experiences with my father began on Friday night. It's the only time the schedule was cleared. And he had time to come and spend with me. And so that's where all my Sabbath memories begin. Jesus cleared his schedule. How can we keep Sabbath like Jesus? Set aside some time to spend with your children. Let's continue with verse 15 of Genesis chapter 1. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and to keep it. All right. Where did Jesus go on the seventh day? He went to a garden. In fact, he put Adam and Eve in a garden too. Now, that's an interesting question. Not only did he clear his schedule, but he planned out a special outing into nature for his children, didn't he? Now, if you take children out into nature, how much of it is going to be a new experience for them? They're going to be discovering things right and left, right? They're going to be excitedly asking questions about it. Now, how can we prepare to keep the Sabbath like Jesus? I'm going to read you a little quote here from the second volume of the Testimonies. How shall we keep the Sabbath? During a portion of the Sabbath day, all should have an opportunity to be out of doors. How can children receive a more correct knowledge of God and their minds be better impressed than in spending a portion of their time out of doors, not in play, but in company with their parents? Let their young minds be associated with God in the beautiful scenery of nature. Let their attention be called to the tokens of his love to man in his created works, and they will be attracted and interested. So Jesus planned an outing to the garden. How do we know that? Well, if you wake up every day of the week in a garden, where are you going to be on Sabbath? In a garden, right? And how can we be certain of that? Well, what alternative did they have? Right? You couldn't get in the car and drive to the city. They were surrounded by nature and a garden. That's what they had. So at that point, we can be certain. Sabbath school doesn't end in the morning. Sabbath school is supposed to continue in the afternoon. As Adam and Eve explored the garden for the first time, how much of nature was new to them? Every single thing they saw. Now, what do kids do when they find something new? They ask you questions, right? So let's put this together. Jesus is resting. He's set aside his labor. He's resting from his labor, but I have this picture that I don't think he got much rest from all the questions Adam and Eve are asking him. Every plant, every bird, every animal, everything is new. Now I have a question. How did Jesus explain nature in the New Testament? If you ask Jesus a question and he begins to talk to you about nature, isn't that when he's telling his parables? In every case, Jesus used nature to explain about God, his character, and his kingdom. Many of the parables begin with the statement, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then Jesus would explain using an example from nature. In fact, one of the most powerful ways to teach children is to take something they're genuinely excited about and find a way to weave in a lesson about God. Now, when Jesus was telling his parables, he says this. It's in Matthew 13:35. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. I always read that and I think, what are the secrets, right? I'm curious. I want to know. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 calls some of these secrets his invisible attributes. And it says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood from the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So where would we go in the Bible to see some of these invisible attributes? Well, two of them are brought to light here in Romans, his eternal power and his Godhead. Now here's another place where you can find a few. I'm going to take you to Jeremiah chapter 51, and it begins to list them. He has made the earth by his power, that's one. He has established the world by his wisdom, that's two. He has stretched out the heaven by his understanding. So that's certainly not a complete list of all of God's invisible attributes, right? And I'd like to add one more from 1 John 4:8. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Right? The last one's pretty important. Never forget the love part, right? So keep these verses handy. We're going to come back to them in a bit here. So we know from the New Testament that Jesus would use nature and the parables to teach a lesson about God. So how would we keep the Sabbath the way Jesus did? Well, on Sabbath, when we go out into nature, when we plan a little outing into the park, what should be our goal? Again, I'm going to read from 2 Testimonies. Parents, why not make use of the precious lessons which God has given us in the book of nature to give our children a correct idea of his character? Okay, it's not always obvious where to start, but there are a few things we can be certain of. Before we can even start, number one, we need to clear the schedule. We need to plan some time to spend with our children on Sabbath. And just as Jesus planned ahead, he planned a Sabbath in the garden. He spent the previous 6 days of the week making everything in that garden. Jesus was prepared. Take the kids to the garden. Number 2. 3, help them discover something new in nature. And lastly, teach them how to see some of God's invisible attributes in nature. You ever go on a hike and you think, I'm not sure, is that one of God's invisible attributes I'm looking at? It's kind of an intimidating place to start, isn't it? It's a little daunting. How would you start? Well, may I suggest that your first attempt may not be entirely elegant. This is probably something we get better at with a little practice, right? And I'm saying that because I'm about to share with you my first attempt, right? We'll get better at this. And then secondly, you've got to pick a place to start. I'll tell you where I start. I start with a simple idea that I'm looking for something in nature that's not an accident. Now, why would I look for something that's not an accident? Well, there's an idea in Western culture and Western thought, and it's so pervasive that it seems to influence us even though we don't always believe it. And this idea is that all of life is an accident. And I don't believe that. I believe that God designed life. He's the creator. So I'm going to start by looking for something that's not an accident. And I would start with a tree. It's a very simple example. But you have to start somewhere. So I'm on a hike, and I'll tell my son, hold on a second. I'm going to pick one of these seeds or nuts for you. And I'll ask him, I want you to pay attention. I want you to hold out your hand. I'm going to break it open and put this tiny little nut in your hand. And you know, you're always tempted at that moment to ask the chicken and the egg problem, you know, the vegetarian version. Which comes first, the tree or the nut? It'll at least give you time to think about your next question while they're thinking about it. But I would start with a very simple. Son, look at the nut, and now look up at that 80-foot tree. Which is more impressive? That nut can grow up into that giant tree, or the opposite. That giant tree can take everything that's in a tree, every root, every branch, every trunk, every leaf, everything in a tree, and miniaturize it down into that tiny little nut to start over. I want to get him thinking. You know where I'm headed. I'm not ready to ask the question yet. Let's not ask if it's an accident yet. We'll go a little further. There's more. But this is something I love about children. They haven't lost their ability to be amazed by nature. And if you think about it, if you know a little about botany, well, you know that the tree is going to make a flower, and that the flower is not going to be productive until it is pollinated by another tree. And that once pollinated, germination will begin, a seed will grow. Finally, the tree will make a hard shell over the nut. That's really what a nut is. It's just a seed with a hard shell, right? And so actually, every nut represents two trees having miniaturized themselves, not one. And that nut will make a tree that's not really identical to either one of the parent trees. All right, well, let's turn to the nut for a moment. You know, if the true purpose of a nut is to do nothing more than grow a new tree, why is it edible? Why do I like eating them? Now, it would make perfect sense to me if the squirrels and the fowl and the birds liked them. There's plenty of seeds in the forest they eat that are really not edible for me, and berries too. But what reward does a seed get for being edible to me? Every time I eat an almond, that will not turn into an almond tree. I digest it. There's nothing in it for the almond, but it gets better. Why is it healthy? If you've ever been to one of Mrs. Teeney's health seminars, you know she'll emphasize having a handful or a couple servings of nuts every day. And why does she do that? Because nuts contain in them some compounds that will help us have a longer, happier, and healthier life. In fact, I found this wonderful article here. I couldn't resist the title. It's called How to Eat Like an Adventist. It's on today.com, NBC. It says a study during the 1990s found that Adventists who ate a handful of nuts at least 5 times a week lived 2 to 3 times longer than people who didn't eat any nuts. More research since then found links between nut eaters and lower rates of cholesterol, blood pressure, chronic inflammation, diabetes, and a myriad of other troubles that add up to cardiovascular disease. In other words, nuts help prevent heart disease. They lower your risk of getting cancer. Why on earth, if the true purpose of a nut is to make a new tree, would it contain medicine for me? But it gets better. Why does it taste so good? You know, I had a coworker who, when it was time to go to lunch, if he'd made the mistake of going to the grocery store and buying a bag of almonds, he'd just skip. He'd say, I don't need lunch. I can't stop. I'm going to be eating almonds all afternoon until the whole bag's gone, and he would every time. His weakness was almonds. Mine's pecans. I'm fortunate that my wife counts out, I get 5 almonds, 5 walnuts, and 5 pecans in my little bag every morning, right? So don't leave me with a bag of pecans. I will eat them. Why does it taste like a little tiny piece of dessert? At this point, if you put all this together, the giant tree knows how to miniaturize itself into this tiny little nut. The little nut is edible to me. It contains medicine for me, and it tastes like a little tiny bit of dessert. We could probably put together that we're looking at one of God's designs. We're looking at God's wisdom here. And let me ask you a question. What kind of person hides medicine in something that tastes really good, like dessert? And I guarantee this little guy would have that question, Because every parent has dealt with this, right? When the fever gets near 103, dad is thinking, I either solve this situation or it's me and Mark at the ER tonight all night waiting because you know they're never ready to see you when you get there. And you know, being an amateur, my first try was the box says it's a wonderful grape flavor for children's Tylenol. I bet he likes it. No, the grape flavor comes right back out. He tried it, and like most little kids, he doesn't like the medicine. So what do I have to do? Well, to avoid going to the ER, I'm going to go to the fridge, and I'm going to grab that sippy cup. I'm going to take his absolute favorite flavor of juice, and I'm going to hide the medicine in something he really likes that tastes good. And then back comes the sippy cup all mixed up. Find the medicine now, little guy. And he tries it, and he'll eat it now. What kind of person does that? A loving parent, that's who. A loving father. Now you remember I said we'd be coming back to some of these attributes of God. His wisdom. How do we see his wisdom? Well, God made the tree and the nut before the fall, before sin, before anyone ever got sick. And yet he put the medicine in it that we would need that would prevent sickness. That's wisdom. How about his understanding? He knew we might not want to take our medicine, so he put it in something that tasted really good. He could sneak it in that way. That's very understanding. And how about love? Who hides medicine like that? A concerned parent who loves their little one. Well, let's continue on the theme of love. How would we show his love? Using nature. I'm going to draw a hint here from Patriarchs and Prophets. It's a good way to get started if you want to do some of this on a Sabbath afternoon. The beauty that clothes the earth is a token of God's love. We may behold it in the everlasting hills, in the lofty trees, in the opening buds and the delicate flowers. All speak to us of God. The Sabbath, ever pointing to him who made them all, bids men open the great book of nature and trace therein the wisdom, the power, and the love of the Creator. Okay, well, if you want to talk about God's love, you're going to need to find one of the tokens of his love. A flower will do nicely. And I would start there. Start with a simple question. Why is it beautiful? You know, the standard response is that this flower has developed such a beautiful petal pattern because it's really trying to get the attention of a pollinator. It needs to attract a bee over there and get pollinated. That's a wonderful story if it was true. I was doing my homework for this sermon, and I was reading articles on how bees find flowers, right? It's a fun way to prepare for a sermon. I came across a National Geographic article where the researcher was testing out how bees find flowers. He needed flowers, so he started making them out of paper. Paper flowers aren't beautiful. And he said there's only two things that matter. You get the color right, and you spray a little of the scent of the original flower on there, and the bees will start showing up. And what that means in plain English is a bee doesn't care whether a flower is as beautiful to you or not. And that makes sense. Why should you and a bee agree on what's beautiful? And paper flowers are not. So the question stands, if it's of no benefit for pollination, why is it beautiful? But I'd move on to the second question. Why does it smell so nice? Again, the standard answer is that flower has developed its scent to attract a pollinator. Yeah, but if you think really carefully, that explains why a flower smells, not why it smells nice. Can you think of any flowers that don't smell nice? I plant marigolds around my garden. They're not pleasant, but they serve as a natural insect repellent, right? And the bees come constantly. You see, it stands to reason the bee actually doesn't care whether you like the smell of that flower or not. And the fact that it smells wonderful to you is not attributed to the pollinator. You know, as I was going through this, I was reading an article in the Washington Post, and the expert who was being interviewed was a chemical ecologist from Cornell University. And he got to his favorite flower as he's describing how the bees find the flowers. And he said, my favorite flower, I've put a picture of it up here, it's the Rangoon creeper. He said it's a big woody vine from tropical Asia with long tubular flowers, and they turn from white to pink and eventually to scarlet. At the pink stage, they're the perfect color of a watermelon. You see the watermelon color up there? It's a little washed out, but it's a pink of a watermelon. And he said, would you believe what the flowers smell like? Watermelon Jolly Ranchers. It's the color of watermelon. It smells like watermelon candy. At this point, is it fair to ask, does that look like an accident? No, that flower was designed to bring joy to a child, wasn't it? Who does that? God. Why would he do that? What message is he trying to send? Well, I can take a shot at that one. What's every boy trying to say when he buys a young woman flowers? He's trying to tell her how he feels about her, right? What is every husband trying to say when he buys his wife a bunch of flowers for Valentine's Day? He's trying to say how much he loves her. Well, then what is God trying to say when he surrounds us with beautiful flowers that have such a wonderful fragrance? He's trying to say how much he loves us. Now, I do want to turn to the New Testament. As I said earlier, it is very rich with examples of how Jesus kept the Sabbath. In fact, enough examples that we could be here all afternoon, but let's just do one example. I want to cover how Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. And I want to cover that example because it's one of the ones that can be hard to interpret correctly. In fact, I've struggled to interpret this one. And it's found in Matthew 12, 9 through 13. Now, when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? So Jesus' first appeal is to the rule or the law of the Pharisees. They allowed a shepherd to rescue a sheep on the Sabbath so that the shepherd would not suffer loss. And he makes an argument, well, I'll continue here in verse 12, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep. Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. And most people, when they read this story, they come away with one phrase. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And there's a challenge there, and I can tell you that all my childhood, in all the questions I ever asked my parents along the lines of, can I do this on the Sabbath? Not once did they say to little Warren, just go do good on the Sabbath. Because they knew that I, as a child, would simply pick something that I thought was good. Right? And there's the challenge in interpreting this. In fact, if we were to pick things that society believes is good, that we think are good, it's not hard to pick them, is it? But are we really the experts or the authority on what's good? You know, when Jesus was talking with the rich young ruler, he told him, no one is good but one, that is God. Or you have to be good to be the expert on what is good, and that means there's only one way to judge what is good. We're going to have to ask Jesus. Now, I'll give you a couple examples of where this becomes a hard story to interpret. Does society judge that it's good to walk down Highway 15 out here and pick up all the litter? Yes. They'll put up a sign, and they'll say, this mile is picked up by the Little Boys and Girls Club of Living Hope Church. Right? And they would say it's good to pick up the litter. Does society, or even would we, if you take the Sabbath off the table, would we say it's good to find the little old lady in the neighborhood who needs all her leaves raked and her gutters cleared, and go help her with that? I think we'd say that's good, wouldn't we? What about our own garden? Would we say it's good to pull all the weeds and plant some flowers? You know, there's one problem with every single one of these examples. You will never find Jesus doing any of those things on the Sabbath, will you? What's missing? That's what we think is good. We need to study this a little more. So it's time for the rest of the story. Do you know this story is found in the other Gospels? And when you turn to the other Gospels, there's more to the story. And I think that's the key to interpreting it. Let's go to Mark chapter 3, verse 4. Then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they kept silent. See, the second time you read it in the other Gospels, it's not just do good on the Sabbath. Now you're asked to consider the alternative. And Jesus paints two options. For what Jesus was talking about, which was work on the Sabbath, it was good to do it on the Sabbath. It would have been evil to wait till Sunday. What is he talking about? Well, look at the last example he gives, to save life or to kill. Who saves life? The doctor. If someone comes into the doctor grievously wounded, maybe they've been stabbed by a knife. I don't mean to be too graphic, and they're bleeding. The Pharisees held that if the physician refused treatment and that person died as a result, that it wasn't just the murderer who was guilty for their death. The physician who refused treatment was also guilty. So Jesus now applies their own law. And he says, if you're dealing with someone who is hurt, and you say, I can't do that till sundown, and they die, that would have been evil. And that's the kind of good Jesus is talking about. All right, so let's go back through these examples. Well, let's start with the highway. Is it good to pick up the litter down there by the highway? Well, society judges that good. Is it evil to wait 24 more hours till Sunday? Of course it's not evil. The litter will still be there. I promise you. It's not going anywhere. It's not evil to wait. How about the little old lady who needs her leaves raked and her gutters cleared? I promise you the leaves will still be there. The gutters will still be full. Even the little old lady will still be there on Sunday. It's not evil to wait. How about the weeds in our own garden? Plant a few flowers. Once again, we might think that's good, but it's not evil to wait, is it? It'd be fine to wait until Sunday to plant the flowers and pull the weeds. Where are the examples where it is evil to wait? Well, what if you work for the police department? You get a 911 call on Sabbath. That's work, isn't it? And you get paid to be a police officer. It is good to heal and help and deliver. But it would be evil to wait 24 hours to respond to that 911 call, wouldn't it? What if you work for the fire department? Somebody calls and their house is on fire, or there's just been a car accident. That's the kind of thing Jesus was talking about. In every walk of life, and this is a story talking about work on the Sabbath, where the work involved relieving human suffering. It was good to do that on the Sabbath, and it was evil to wait. But if you notice, Jesus only applies this logic when he's healing people, when he's relieving human suffering. And that's how we're to apply it. That's why it has such a stark contrast between good and evil there. All right, our closing thought. How did Jesus keep the Sabbath? You know, in our scripture today was Isaiah 58, and it tells us that Jesus made the Sabbath a delight. All right, well, how can we make the Sabbath a delight? We'd have to get back to keeping it the way Jesus did. All right. Our closing hymn is number 381.
Please stand.
Holy Sabbath day of rest, my Master richly blessed, God created and divine, set aside for holy time. Bless the
If you would bow your heads with me. Our Father, which art in heaven, we thank you again for our Sabbath day. We thank you that we could join together in worshiping you. We ask that you would send your Spirit to be with each of us as we leave this place, and that you would be our guide throughout this coming week. And Lord, we ask that you would help us to make the Sabbath our delight, and to set aside a special time when we can make it the delight of our children as well. In your name we pray. Amen.